anything to cut that, or?
No, we're not gonna cut it.
No, we're not. We're just gonna.
We all lean down and grab it with our teeth. No.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not gonna eat it right now.
Oh, okay. I'm just gonna look at
We'll
it.
eat it later.
Okay.
Somebody try that. Where's the just messages?
No, it's Pastor Mark. Hi, Pastor Mark. You don't have to climb under. You lean. You bouncing it. Okay, there you go. You can go over here and have a seat if you're ready. Honey, Lane, stop pushing your face window. Hey, Ed, it's time. We'll twist it a little bit. No, it's not in there. Because earlier I was sitting up closer here. Oh, we'll just back up. We'll scoot. There you go.
Is he in now? He's in now.
There he is.
The crowd loves
Alright. Okay. So,
Man says the crowd loves
So welcome to our home as we try to do our best to give people an idea of what a first century Passover Seder may have looked like. At the Denton Church of the Brethren, we've been exploring and going on a journey through the many Jewish holidays and seeing how Christ is represented in each one of them and how he fulfills so much of the symbolism in each of the ceremonies for the holidays. And so now we've come to Passover, and there's a few things to take note of before we get started with the actual Seder. First of all, it's important to know that Seder means ceremony or order. So it is the order in which we celebrate the Passover, or at least we celebrate or commemorate the Passover meal. The other thing is to take note of kind of where we've been on this journey in the past couple Sundays. We've talked about how we arrived to Jerusalem about 10 days early, so that way we could get all the materials that we needed that you see on the table here. We also talked about how we watched Jesus enter into the city about 5 days before today. So it had been 5 days ago. And now we've come to Nisan, the 14th of Nisan. Something about the calendar. It's important to know that the Jewish calendar and the calendar that we use are not the same calendar. And so today is the 14th of Nisan, and Jews today are celebrating the Passover meal. Well, not exactly today. Let me explain that too. So in the Jewish calendars, days start and end at sundown. So in our own calendar, days start and end when we're asleep at midnight. But in the Jewish calendar, days start and end at sundown. So for the next hour or so, it is Nisan 14. But in about an hour, sometime between 7:30, 8 o'clock, if I remember correctly, it will be Nisan 15. And according to Scripture, according to Exodus chapter 12, the meal is supposed to be eaten on Nisan 15. It says the night after, which would be the Passover lamb has been sacrificed. So the Passover lamb would have been sacrificed today, Nisan 14, and we would be eating this meal once the sun goes down. Now, for our purposes, we made it a little bit earlier, so that way people that need to get to work tomorrow and things like that could hopefully observe and worship and enjoy the service with us. Keep in mind, what's happened over the last few days is we selected a Passover lamb, probably one of the ones that came from the fields outside of Bethlehem. That was set aside for a few days. And then earlier today, we went with all the crowds and all the lambs to the temple. And at the temple, we sacrificed, or we slaughtered our lamb, and then handed over the lamb to the temple priests. The temple priests then took that lamb and put it on the sacrificial fires that were there and roasted the lamb. They took their portion and gave it, and God's was burned up on the fire, and then they returned our portion. And that is what you see there in front of us. More than likely, it would have been a larger portion back then. But for us, that size was just enough for the four of us. We, after it being sacrificed, we and burned on the altar, and after we got it back, we rushed back home. The sacrifices probably would have taken, and the slaughtering all probably would have taken place in the early afternoon. And so we don't have a lot of time before sundown. So we've got a short period of time to get a lot of things together. People here at home have been working hardly to prepare things like the bitter herbs and the karaset, which I'll explain in a little bit, and the matzah, the unleavened bread, and making sure that we have wine, in our case, grape juice, for the ceremony. All these things are important and symbolic of what is going to occur or what has already occurred in Exodus, and in God saving the Jews from Egypt, and then also what is going to occur in the next few days with regard to Christ and him dying and resurrecting from the dead, and him being our redemption. I can't think, well, the other thing is, let me just note for you that we're not going to celebrate some of the more modern traditions of what we see in love feasts. There is some question about what a first century love feast looked like. Now, we have some historical evidence of what would have occurred. Some of that is from Hillel, a teacher, or a rabbi, from the first century BC to the first quarter of the first century CE. There's other writings, and believe it or not, even the Gospels from our own New Testament are used to try to gain evidence and get an idea and understanding of what a first century Passover would have looked like. There's some debate about those things. We'll talk about that later. But for the most part, like for nowadays, you'd see a plate in the center that would have all these things in it, and they'd have little divots for all the different pieces of the Passover meal. And of course, they wouldn't have lamb because there are no more sacrifices, because the Temple Mount was destroyed in 70 AD or CE. So this is going to be different than a Passover Seder that you might see in a Jewish home today, because we are trying our best to try to recreate what would have happened in the first century. We can't be positive about it, but we're gonna do our best. We're also going to be a little bit abbreviated. We're not going to go through all the motions of the Passover Seder. We're going to try to hit the highlights and skim over just about everything, but we won't go through all the pieces, because as far as I can tell, a Passover Seder the whole thing would have lasted about an hour and a half. And I don't know that I can keep everybody's attention for that long, but I at least want to give you an idea of what it may have kind of looked like. And then think about, what does this mean about who Christ is in regard to all this symbolism and all these things that we do. So what would have happened, our guests would have come in. Those who were coming from the outside, their feet would have been washed by one of our servants. The rest of us who are here in the home don't need to do those kinds of things because we've been at home and haven't been walking on the dusty streets. And they would have been invited to sit at a table like this. Now, the person that was officiating or the head would have been sitting at the head of the table. Maybe the father or the grandfather, or if there was a rabbi that was facilitating the Passover Seder, he would have been, or officiating it, they would have been sitting at the head of the table. And then around the table, you would have gone in some sort of order, like oldest to youngest. And so you see Donis, and then Evan, and then Liam. We've gone in order of oldest to youngest around the table. Some might have done it in order of importance, or chosen some other way of ordering how people sat around the table. But we've got, of course, you involved, and so you're on that side of the table. But just imagine everybody kind of going around the table here in order of age. And the person, in this case the father, would have started the service. Well, let me explain first too. So you see a glass, an empty glass here. This is for our wine. The Passover Seder is structured around drinking 4 glasses of wine. And so that's important to recognize too, that as we go through, you're going to see 4 glasses of wine drank. And that kind of gives us a structure and an order to what we are doing and when we are doing it. They're transitions, if you might. For those of you who are Church of the Brethren also, I encourage you to, as we go through this, see if you can find allusions to our own love feast in this. As I was studying and as I was preparing for this, I was just so excited, and I was like, oh, that's just like what we do. Including, one of the things that would have happened in preparation before we got here is that we would have hunted through the house looking for leaven and made sure that there was no leaven in the house. That's in part of the order in Exodus chapter 12, that no leaven shall be eaten. And actually, we're not supposed to eat it for the next, if I remember correctly, 8 days as we celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But some point today on Nisan 14, we would have gone through the house searching for all this leaven. And we would have made sure that there was none in the house because we don't want to make the mistake of eating it. Leaven in this case is symbolic of something. It's symbolic of sin. If you remember, it said that doesn't it take just a little bit of leaven to leaven the whole loaf? The idea that just a little bit of sin is enough to puff up an entire loaf of bread, and maybe it puffs us up, makes us think of ourselves as something more than who we really are, and we get the relationship between God and us a little bit backwards. The other thing about, well, let me stop there, I think. So what would have happened at this point, like I said, is the father would have began. Oh, I was going to say, that kind of reminds me, I apologize. That kind of reminds me of our own love feast, when we take time at the beginning of the service to reflect, right? We take time to reflect upon who we are and who God is, and the relationships that we have with Him and the relationships that we have with one another, and we examine ourselves. And if we find any sin, if we find any leaven, we are encouraged to take care of it. We are encouraged to go to a brother or sister and make right with them. We are encouraged to go to God in prayer and make right with Him. That we are encouraged to remove the leaven from our lives. You know, it reminds me too that in the Bible it says that we are to, when we see sin, that we are to run away from it. Get rid of all the leaven. Take care of all of it so that there's no temptation. And that is definitely a part of the Passover Seder. So now, finally, let's get started. The thing that would begin the Passover Seder would be the Kiddush. Blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who has chosen us from among all people, and raised us above all tongues, and made us holy through his commandments. And as you, God, our God, have given us in love festivals for happiness, feast and in festive seasons for rejoicing, the day of this feast of Matzot, and this festival of holy convocation, the season of our freedom, a holy convocation, commemorating the departure from Egypt, for you have chosen us and sanctified us from all the nations, and you have given us as a heritage your holy festivals, in happiness and joy. Blessed are you, God, who sanctifies Israel in the festive seasons. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who has granted us life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this occasion. At this point, the first cup of wine, and like I said, in our case, grape juice, is poured. And more than likely, in the first century, especially for those families who were poorer, Evan and I, as we were discussing this earlier, he was talking about how some of maybe the more wealthy families, those that were from the Sanhedrin or those that were from the Sadducees or the Pharisees, they may have had more cups. But I imagine that most of us probably would have just had one cup and would have all been drinking out of the same cup. This first cup symbolizes sanctification, the setting apart. It seems fitting that we've gotten rid of all this leaven. And in the love feast, we've examined ourselves and done our best to deal with the sin in our lives. And now we are prepared to experience the Passover as sanctified people, as people that are set apart for him. And so the first part of Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 7 is read. I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. Symbolic of him setting the Jews apart from the Egyptians, pulling them out, making them a separate people, a sanctified people. And so at this point, the grape juice will be shared. Now, because we're not going to share germs today, I'm going to just kind of symbolize that and allow our resident grape juice expert to go ahead and drink the grape juice for us at this time. At this point, we would do hand washing. It's largely symbolic. It also fulfills, I believe, the needs in the kosher laws about how to eat certain foods. And so at this point, there would be a bowl on the table because we lack some room on ours. We have a bowl here and a towel. And at this point, we were just ritually cleanse our hands. This is before we touch wet food, and that's going to be the karpas or the bitter herbs. And so I'm going to go ahead and wash and dry my hands and then pass this bowl around for the rest of the family to go ahead and wash and dry their hands. You'll notice that we're sitting at a table like it's our coffee table, and we're sitting on the floor. The Passover meal would have been eaten kind of kicked back and relaxed. There would have been a table about 12 to 18 inches off the floor. Ours is probably a little bit tall. I keep trying to sit up straight so you can see us. And we would have been sitting on pillows and just kicked back in kind of a relaxed manner. Once everyone has finished washing their hands and drying them, then we get to the next very symbolic part of the Passover Seder, falling under this first cup. We're going to go through the first dipping of the bitter herbs. So for bitter herbs today, we have parsley and lettuce and horseradish. At this point, the head, the person that is facilitating or officiating the Passover, would have taken the bitter herbs and would have explained that not necessarily the bitter herbs at this point, but what we are about to dip them into, salt water, is symbolic of the tears that the Israelites cried while they were in bondage. We know that the Israelites cried out to God for him to save them, for him to rescue them out. And so we have in front of us a bowl, and it's filled with salt water. And at this point, we dip our bitter herbs in the salt water, and as we eat it, we reflect upon the tears of the Jews as they were in bondage in Israel. You want to tear a piece of lettuce off? There you go. And this is very new to everybody, so we're learning about what kind of things might we be willing to try, and what kind of things might we not be willing to try. At this point in the service, this is a debatable part of the Passover Seder. There are some that think that this piece of the service may have been added much later than the first century. I think it was there. I'll explain why later. But at this point, there are 3 pieces of matzah, 3 pieces of unleavened bread that are taken out. They're stacked 3 on top of, or 1 on top of the other. The middle one is taken out. There are some that say that the 3 of them represent God, the God 3 in 1. The middle one taken out is then broken in 2. One piece is then returned to our stack of matzah. The other is considered the afikomen. It's Greek. It basically means after the meal. I guess it's kind of like dessert. I'm going to take a cloth that I have. I'm going to hide the afikomen in it. And then I'm going to set that aside someplace, out of sight, out of mind. And that's going to be put away for later. You might find it interesting that there's a Greek word in the Passover Seder, afikomen. Well, it's not all that strange. Languages, there were a lot of languages being used kind of all at once in the first century, especially around the Middle East. You had Hebrew and Greek, and I'm sure that there was some Latin being used, and then also, it escapes me, but there are lots of different languages. In fact, the word synagogue is a Greek word. So not as strange as we think. At this point, all the food is removed from the table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Donis to just kind of pass to Evan. We have another table over here. We're going to pass the food over and remove it from our table. Now at this point, the youngest son is probably getting curious about everything that's going on, hopefully. And once all the food is removed, he is going to ask some questions. First, we're going to pour the second glass of wine. This is, if you think of it, the second part of our Passover Seder. Don't drink it yet.
Sorry.
I'll let you know when. And so at this point, the youngest, in this case Liam, is going to read some questions for us.
Why is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights we eat leavened or unleavened bread, but this night only unleavened bread. On all other nights we eat all kinds of herbs, but this night only bitter herbs. Why do we dip the herbs twice? On all other nights we eat meat roasted, stewed, or boiled, but on this night why only roasted meat?
Thank you. At this point, the person officiating the service would answer all these questions. He'd recount the history of Israel from Abraham till Moses and the giving of the law. Now, all of this is to fulfill God's commandment in the Old Testament that this be passed down, that the knowledge, the memory of what happened at Passover, what he did for the Jews by rescuing them out of Egypt, is passed down from generation to generation to generation. And so the youngest child asking these questions then gives the opportunity for someone to answer them and pass on this information. You can imagine that just like there's variety in our love feast and how some pastors might be a little bit more long-winded, others might be a little bit more succinct and quick to the point. But at this point, you can imagine that there's a variety of different stories. All the stories will be the same, of course. It'll be the story of Abraham and Moses and the giving of the law. But some fathers or grandfathers or rabbis might expound a little bit more on what that means to us. And some might just stick with the story. We're not going to go through all that right now. That would add a lot of time to our Passover Seder. So for right now, I'm just going to let you know that that's what would happen. All those questions would be answered. We tell the story of the Exodus, basically, and the giving of the law to Moses. And then all the food is returned to the table. So let's go ahead and pass the food back onto the table. Now, as I was learning this, I thought to myself, well, this is strange. Why would they go ahead and take all the food off the table simply to put it back on again? Well, this is what I think. I'm not 100% positive, but this is what I think. I think it removes the temptation for those of us who have been waiting all day since the sacrifice to eat something. Can you imagine the little kids starting to reach over to the table to grab a little piece of matzah and the parents slapping their hands because they're supposed to be paying attention to what is being said by the grandfather or the father or the rabbi, the person that's telling the story of the Exodus and the giving of the law to Moses. That's the important part. See, this meal is not just a meal. We're not just sitting down and having dinner, just like Liam highlighted a couple minutes ago in his questions. This all means something. It all symbolizes something. And so just like dipping the karpas, the bitter herbs into the salt water, symbolize the tears of the Jews in bondage. All these things mean something to us. And they meant something to the Jews and to the disciples and to Jesus celebrating this in the first century. I now explain the significance of all these things. It would be the job of the officiant to do that. Of course, we've already talked about leaven and how it symbolizes sin, and how the unleavened bread is symbolic of not only the idea that, and it reminds us of the idea that the Jews had to leave quickly and that God rescued them quickly, but that they are set apart, that there is no leaven in there, that there is something sanctified about us. The bitter herbs remind us of the bitterness of slavery. And so when we eat them, the bitterness in our mouth reminds us of the suffering that the Jews went through during the slavery in Egypt. And of course, the piece of lamb. That's the sacrificial lamb. The lamb that was the replacement for the firstborn of Israel. See, when the spirit of death went through Egypt and took the firstborn of every living thing, livestock included, didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, because the Israelites had offered a lamb and placed its blood on their doorposts, it was that lamb that served as their replacement, or the replacement for the firstborn of each family. That's why the lamb is so important. It's like Isaac when he is taken up on the mountain and Abraham goes to sacrifice him, and God provides a replacement, a ram caught in a thicket. We'll get back to this a little bit later. I'm hoping that you might be able to start to figure out on your own how Christ might fulfill some of the symbolism here. And of course, these three things are all the pieces that God has commanded through Moses the Israelites to partake in yearly on the evening after Nisan 14. As I look out the windows, it's almost sundown, so we're almost there. At this point, we would sing or chant or recite the first of the Halal Psalms. That would be Psalms. The Halal Psalms are Psalms 113 through 118. This would be Psalms 113 through 114. And we're not going to do the whole thing. Again, we're going to try to abbreviate it a little bit here for sake of time. But what I'm going to do is chant them, and then I'm going to ask the family to say hallelujah afterwards. Praise the Lord, praise, O servants of the Lord, praise the name of the Lord.
Hallelujah.
Let the name of the Lord be praised, both now and forevermore.
Hallelujah.
From the rising of the sun to the place where it sets, the name of the Lord is to be praised.
Hallelujah.
And that would continue on through the rest of I think all the monks in Caroline County probably have job security. I don't think I'm going to be chanting anywhere anytime soon. But that would go on through the rest of the Psalms, 113 through 1 through 14. And then we would pray a prayer of blessing, again, the Kiddush, over the second cup of wine. We're still on the second cup of wine. Blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. This cup signifies or symbolizes deliverance, as it is recorded for us in Exodus chapter 6. I will deliver you from their bondage. At this point, again, each person would drink from the cup as it is passed around the table. And again, our resident grape expert, Evan, is going to drink that for us. Now there is a second hand washing. We're not going to go through that, but we would again pass the bowl of water and the towel along, go through a second hand washing. All of this food then is then served. It's open for anyone to eat. First, the leader, the officiant, the father, grandfather, rabbi would pray a blessing over the bread. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to eat unleavened bread. At this point, the officiant would now go to the person next to him and break their bread for them, and then also break his own. And at this point, the two of them together would dip their bread in keraset. So this is keraset. I'm going to try to hold it out a little bit for you so you can see. It is basically fruit and nuts kind of mixed together and chopped up really finely. What I've done, it usually involves pears, apples. Some people put in figs and raisins. Some people add cinnamon to it. Usually walnuts, maybe pecans. What I did is I finely ground some walnuts, and I added some finely chopped apples and some raisins, and I put a little bit of apple butter in there from the Shenandoah Valley. And so the two of us would actually then dip our matzot into the keraset and use this. So Jewish matzot or unleavened bread is much more stiff than this. So then we would take that. Excuse me.
It's really good.
And this would begin the meal. At this point, everything on the table is up for grabs. The horseradish, the parsley, the lettuce, the lamb, yes, go ahead. The matzot, the carousel. Everything can be eaten. And to your heart's desire, till you're full. There may have been water provided on the table for extra drink. The bitter herbs may have been dipped in the carousel, but
Okay.
but not so much that it would have interfered with the bitterness of it. Remember, the importance of this meal is not to have dinner and be satisfied physically. The importance of this meal is to remember and reflect upon what God did for the Israelites and will do for us, the promises that he has provided us. And so if I was to dip some of the bitter herbs into the carousel, I might shake off anything hanging on. So there's a little bit of sweet there, but the bitterness very much still stands out. Well, after the meal is over, and so I'm going to ask these guys to stop eating once you finish that piece that you got in your mouth. Don't shove the whole... Okay. Once the meal is over, the afakomen is then taken out. Remember, it's been hidden. See if you can follow along with me here. It has been hidden. It has been put away. This bread is now taken by the person that is leading the Passover service, and small pieces are torn off of it and passed to each of the people in the room that are here celebrating the Passover. No. This is eaten without any carousel, without dipping at all. Then a blessing is provided. Again, the Kiddush. A blessing for the bread, the afakomen, that was hidden away and is now come back, is offered. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to eat unleavened bread. It is important that after eating the afakomen together that we do not drink any water or wine until the next glass of wine. All of this is eaten in a reclined position, relaxed. We are enjoying and celebrating and reflecting upon the freedom that God provided the Israelites when he rescued them out of Egypt. Now, after the meal, the third cup of wine is poured. At this point, the post-meal blessing, the grace is recited after the meal, and then the prayer over the third cup. The name of the Lord be blessed from now until eternity. Let us bless him, of whose gifts we have partaken. Blessed be our God, of whose gifts we have partaken, and by whose goodness we exist. Blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. This third cup symbolizes redemption. And so we read Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 7, the next portion. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. And so the third glass, the glass of redemption, is drank from and passed by each of the people celebrating the Passover. And that is the third cup. Now we come to the fourth cup. The fourth cup of wine is poured. It as well is blessed by reciting the Kiddush. Blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. This cup is the cup of praise, acceptance, completion. And so the last of Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 7 is read. Then I will take you as my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Now this glass is passed around the table, and each shall take a drink. At this point, the last part of a Hallel, Psalms 115 through 118 are sung together. And that would end the Passover meal. That would end, meal is the wrong word. Yes, go ahead. That would be the wrong word. Seder, ceremony, the Passover service. Because remember, it's not about the food. It's about what the food means. So a few things that I want to reflect on, not a lot, but some of them that I alluded to when we first got started. First of all is the timing. We talked about the calendar, that this is Nisan 14. It might be at Nisan 15 now because it's sundown. But more importantly, is this the day? Was it Nisan 14 or the first few hours of Nisan 15 that Jesus ate the Last Supper with his disciples? There's some debate about that. Let me share what I believe. There's some evidence out there that the Jews in the northern part of the kingdom celebrated the Passover a little bit differently than the Jews in the southern part of the kingdom. The Jews around Galilee celebrated kind of a Passover Eve. I'm sure that there are some families that celebrate Christmas Eve. They have their own traditions. Maybe they allow their kids to open up one present on Christmas Eve. In a similar way, the Jews around Galilee, where Jesus and his disciples were from, they celebrated Suda Masaket. It was part of Passover, but it was celebrated in the evening of Nisan 14. Now remember, that's not now. The evening of Nisan 14 was yesterday, because the day starts at night after the sundown. So imagine it's Nisan 13. There are other sacrifices going on in the temple, sacrifices of preparation. There may have been meat at the table when Jesus ate with his disciples. But what they are now going to celebrate as the Last Supper is Suda Masaket. It would have been much like the Passover. In fact, the word Passover in Hebrew may have been used interchangeably. They may have thought about it very much as this is part of the Passover. So when Christ tells his disciples, I have very much looked forward to eating this Passover with you, just because he is celebrating or beginning it without the Paschal lamb, he is still celebrating in the Galilean mind part of the Passover. What this means, what this allows, is that on the 13th, as they gather all the necessary things to have their meal, and then in the wee hours of the Nisan 14, as the day begins with the setting of the sun, he eats this meal with them, and then goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there is arrested, and later on in the evening he is tried, and then judgment is pronounced in the early morning, and then Jesus is tortured and crucified on Nisan 14. And then in the early afternoon, at the same time that the sheep, the Paschal lambs, the Passover lambs, are being slaughtered and sacrificed, Christ is hung on the cross and dies. And so by the time the rest of the Jews are sitting and eating this Passover supper together, Jesus has already died. His body has already been taken down from the cross. And before the setting of the sun, when the Passover Sabbath begins on Nisan 14, his body is buried. Imagine what it would have been like for his followers now coming around this table, trying to finish the celebration that they had started with the man that they had loved and followed and looked up to so much. This timing allows Jesus to not only celebrate Passover with his disciples, but also be our redemption, be our Passover lamb. I noted that there is an order to the way we are sitting. In our case, it's oldest to youngest. In some cases, it might be most important down to least. In this case, Liam is not the least important. He just happens to be the youngest. But it brings to mind, do you remember the disciples are asking, who is it that's going to betray you? Who is it, Jesus? Who's the one? Do you remember his response? Do you remember how he tells them or shows them who's the one that's going to betray him? He says, "It is the one with whom I dip this bread." Is it possible? Is it possible that Judas was sitting right next to Jesus in the seat that would have been sat in by the person that was most important? In this moment, did Jesus actually give Judas the seat of honor as he dips his bread into the carousel, much like Donis and I had done to start the Passover meal? I don't know. And then I'm hoping that you caught the symbolism of the Afikomen. Like I said, there are some that believe that this is a much later tradition, that it didn't exist. But when we look to the Gospels, we find Jesus doing this same exact thing, taking the bread, breaking it in pieces, handing those pieces to his disciples, and then praying a blessing over it. And not just renewing a covenant, but making a new one with us. You know, because of the timing, the meat, the Passover lamb at least, may not have been there. It's possible that no meat was. I don't know that there was any meat at all. And it makes sense that this would have happened on the 13th and the Passover lamb would not have been there, because Christ tells us that the bread now is his body. Wouldn't he have used the Passover lamb to symbolize that? Flesh and flesh. Instead, he uses bread, the thing that is set apart for a purpose. This is the symbolism of the new covenant now. It's also important because we can still eat unleavened bread. We can no longer eat a Passover lamb. Since 70 AD, when the Romans decimated the Temple Mount, there has not been a single sacrifice. By making the bread his body, he ensured that we would continue to be able to remember him as our Passover lamb. This Afikomen that was once hidden, buried, as you might say, and is now brought back out. This is Christ's body. Christ's body that will be buried will rise again. It will come out again, that we might all partake in the resurrection. I think it's also possible that he was celebrating this off a Coman, that he was using this, that this tradition, the part of the ceremony was there. Because right afterwards, there's the cup. And we find that in our own celebration of communion. That immediately after the blessing of the bread and the covenant, the new covenant that is provided through the bread, he takes a cup. The cup of redemption. Christ, our Redeemer. Christ, our substitute, just like the Passover lamb. Christ that takes our place, the one that suffers death as the firstborn of God, so that we don't have to. Christ also says that he won't be able to finish this Passover. He won't be able to finish it with his disciples until he comes back again, until he has joined us in heaven. I have a feeling, and again, I can't be certain, but it seems to make sense that after the third cup, it's possible that Christ stopped the Passover Seder, that Christ stopped whatever the Last Supper celebration was that they were having. They never got to the fourth cup. Why? Because it's the cup of completion. You see, his work, though it is finished on the cross, it is not yet complete. Is it? He still has a return to make. So, will this last cup be drank in heaven? The cup of completion, finally, after he returns a second time and reclaims the creation that is rightfully his. Or maybe he finished it on the cross when he said, "It is finished." Maybe his blood was the wine of the fourth cup. I hope you've been able to see some of the symbolism from the Passover meal that Christ fulfills, he completes, and how incredibly beautiful all of this is, how incredibly meaningful and rich and valuable all of it is. I am left thinking about Jesus and who he is to us and the incredible timing that God had. As we read the Gospels, people will find minute details. They'll find pieces to pick out to try to claim that it's not true. And they'll point especially to these last few moments in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The differences that they record. Well, he couldn't have been the Passover meal. He couldn't have celebrated Passover with them. He couldn't have been the Passover lamb, because if he celebrated the Passover meal, then the sheep already would have been sacrificed. The gospel writers were not concerned about that one bit. Remember, as they were writing these, their whole motive was to get across who Jesus is. Timing necessarily wouldn't have meant much to them as they were writing the exact timeline, but the meaning would have. That should give us some comfort. But God is an incredible God of timing. That all these things would fall into place, that Christ would be sacrificed at the exact time that the Passover lambs were, that all these symbols would have been laid out thousands of years before in the Passover celebration, the Passover feast after the Exodus from Egypt, that all these things would point to Jesus as the Messiah. But the timing isn't done. See, God has one more incredible surprise of timing. There is one more Jewish celebration to come. One more. And that will happen on a morning in 3 days. I invite you to join us for our Resurrection Sunday worship service. Find out what that great surprise is. Find out what that incredible timing is. Find out what that last Jewish holiday that Christ fulfills is. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that it has been a blessing to you.